I'm Professor Michael Brown. I'm at the University of St Andrews. I'm a medieval Scottish historian and I am the author of The Black Douglases. I think they allow you to talk about a different aspect of medieval society, one that was really important for Scotland, which was the growth of some of the great aristocratic families of the kingdom and the way in which their ambitions and their actions did as much as the kings of Scotland to create the country. Well, Douglas is born into a Scotland that's facing a crisis. Scotland is a country which is formed around a royal dynasty, and that dynasty has died out. The death of the king, Alexander III, in an accident, falling from his horse, leaves Scotland without a male king, a male ruler, and his only descendant is his granddaughter, who's in Norway, a Norwegian princess, and when she dies, the royal dynasty is ended and Scotland is left without a ruler, and its leaders, its churchmen and its nobles are having to navigate this unprecedented situation. And Scotland also faces an issue, which is that the kings of England to the south have always, if you like, nourished a claim to be the overlords or the effective rulers over Scotland. And the King of England, Edward I, a crusader, a conqueror, a man of huge ambitions, sees this as an opportunity to make good that claim and to establish himself first as the overlord of Scotland, the man who's directing affairs in Scotland, but I think he always is looking to actually bring Scotland into his dominions. I think it's quite hard to understand how members of the Scottish nobility felt about the situation at the end of the 13th century. We tend to think in terms of nations. I think they thought in terms of families. I think thought in terms of their estates and their inheritances and what they had to protect and pass on to their own sons and grandsons, their own inheritance, if you like. And that was their prime consideration. They were part of the Scottish kingdom, and at the same time, many of them were also participants in the English kingdom too. And for a long time, those nobles had wanted a peaceful relationship between the two lands because that allowed them to enjoy their property in both kingdoms. When the crisis comes, I think that nobility is forced to choose sides. But quite often they're choosing on the basis of what protects their lands and interests most effectively. So a family like the Bruces, for example, has a range of issues. They claim to be the kings. Robert Bruce, who's ultimately going to become king, he's from a family that sees themselves as the rightful rulers of Scotland, but they're also barons in England and they're nobles in Scotland. So they're balancing all these different contradictory interests and trying to, if you like, steer a course in which they're going to make gains or they're going to be able to defend what they have already. I think there is an identity. I think it depends who you are and why you're asking the question as to how people respond to the question, are you Scottish? I think there is a sense of Scotland as a distinct kingdom. And the kings of Scotland have done a lot to foster that. They want to create this sense of Scotland as a distinct unit, as people who are looking to them for leadership. The other body, I think, which works very hard to create a sense of Scottishness is the church. Scotland is recognised as a province, as a unit of the Western Christian, the Latin Catholic Church, and that's a way of expressing its distinctiveness from England. And the Scottish clergy are very worried about being absorbed into a much larger unit, into being absorbed under the authority of the English archbishops in York and Canterbury. So they have a very strong interest in articulating not simply that the church is separate, but there is a distinct Scottish nation that exists underneath that church, and the church is serving that nation to a certain extent. And I think if you are from a local Scottish community, if you're a townsperson or a local knight or squire, you have no interests in England, you look to the King of Scotland and to his officials, then you see yourself as existing in this Scottish world. And it's interesting, a lot of the people who provide leadership in the struggle come from that class. They're motivated by the church, but they're driven by a sense that this is the natural order of things, that they are Scottish and they're part of this Scottish kingdom. They're a middle-ranking baronial family, so they're noblemen. So the Douglas family would be considered as a middle-ranking baronial family. They have significant estates, but they're probably not of the top or maybe even the second rank of the nobility, so they're not the earls or the great lords of the kingdom. But they have been around for a long time. They're probably initially from Flanders in the Low Countries, a family that comes across and settles in Scotland about 200 years before the lifetime of James Douglas. So they're an old established family within the Scottish nobility at this time. We don't know a lot about James Douglas's childhood. He's still quite a young man when the wars start. In fact, a youth really. His father is imprisoned by the English and dies in captivity, and his lands are taken from the family and given to an English baron, Robert Clifford. So Douglas faces the prospect of losing his lands, losing his status, losing his place in society and his expectations. And I think he also sees this as part of a bigger picture. So this is the way people talk about him later. So he would see it as part of a picture whereby Scotland and its kings have been disinherited. So in the same way that he's lost his lands, so have the kings of Scots. So it's part of a bigger picture that Douglas, I think, would probably grow up thinking about. So what we know about James Douglas's childhood comes from a poem, a long historical poem written in the 1370s by John Barber, which is about Robert Bruce, but in which James Douglas is the other main character. And Douglas is a favourite of that author, and I think he's tapping into a sense that James Douglas is this big figure from the Scottish past. And Barber tells us that James goes into exile, and a lot of Scots go to the French court, partly for safety, but also partly to try and encourage the French king to support them against Edward of England. And it's quite likely, therefore, that James grows up. The person that he's linked to is the Bishop of St Andrews, William Lamberton, who may be his patron and protector. And Lamberton is in Paris. So all those things make it really quite likely that James Douglas spends some time in France before returning with the bishop to Scotland in 1304. Well, I think the moment that's crucial in James Douglas's story is the point at which he decides to join Bruce. It comes sometime in February or early March 1306. Bruce has just murdered his main rival for the leadership of the Scots, John Comyn, and is trying to, if you like, to revive the Scottish kingdom. He's trying to have himself crowned king, and to do that he needs to muster supporters. He has the backing of the church, and we're told that James Douglas is sent by the Bishop of St Andrews to go and join Robert. And it's presented as a meeting between these two men in the hills of southwestern Scotland, where James recognises Robert as king, performs homage to him and joins his service. It's presented very much as a set piece, and in the poem it's presented as something which is going to be this great relationship between these two men and is going to achieve great things for each of them, but also for Scotland. I think we have information about James's relationship with Robert Bruce from the poem, The Bruce, written 70 years later, but also from some contemporary evidence too. And that shows James Douglas as a useful and effective local leader in Robert's camp for quite a long period. So James Douglas's lands are in southern Scotland, and Robert himself is campaigning further north. So he's trying to win control of northern Scotland, the area that's furthest from England and most secure as a base from which he can operate. James Douglas, by comparison, is operating in a much more dangerous environment, much closer to England, much closer to the English forces that can be sent across the border. And so James is presented as this leader of a band of outlaws in the forest, harassing the English in the south, trying to recapture his own castle at Douglas, which he manages to do on 3 separate occasions, but he doesn't have the strength to hold it, so ultimately he just destroys it, so the English can't use it too. So James is very much a kind of guerrilla fighter, if you like. And it's only really in 1314 So, 8 years later, that James emerges as a major figure. And that's when he takes the large royal castle at Roxburgh, close to the Anglo-Scottish border. He creeps up to the wall, his men disguised in black cloaks to make them look like cattle moving around in the dark. They scale the wall with rope ladders and surprise the garrison inside and take the castle. So James Douglas emerges onto the scene, I think, with this spectacular act of bravery and military skill as well. And thereafter, I think he becomes quite rapidly a central figure in the war against England. And I think that's what's interesting. James Douglas's reputation is always as a soldier. And he's a soldier that fights in a slightly unconventional way. So the way that he's presented in English accounts is as this kind of figure of the night, really, as a bogeyman, as a monster, who is prepared to do all kinds of atrocious things to win, who, in a sense, blasphemes. When he's outside the English-held town of Berwick, he says, "I'd rather enter Berwick than enter paradise." So this is a man who, in a sense, is on the edge of the normal rules of chivalric warfare. He massacres prisoners, he mutilates prisoners, he doesn't treat them as honourable chivalric enemies. And the Scots clearly love that about him. At the same time, Bruce and his other leaders are presented as these chivalric heroes, playing by the rules, seeking honour, seeking to respect the English as adversaries. James Douglas is this person who's breaking the rules of warfare. And the English see him in the same way, and they call him the Black Douglas. The Scots call him the Good Sir James. So you have this kind of dual reputation. If he's on your side, he's great. If he's against you, he's this kind of frightening figure. I mean, we know about the personalities of James and Robert from the work that's written in the 1370s by John Barber, the Bruce, and that presents James Douglas not simply as a war leader. It also mentions him, for example, when he and Bruce are on the run with their families, as James Douglas is the man who is keeping the spirits of the ladies up. He's telling them stories, he's entertaining them. He's a young knight, and he's fulfilling that duty where Robert is a serious king at the head of the cause, if you like. So there is a kind of lighter element to James that is being brought out in that poem, but it's not something that you find in the contemporary record. There you see him as this soldier, but also as someone who's got a sense of humour. Barber has him tell this story where his companion, the other main leader under Robert Bruce, Thomas Randolph, wants to attack the English head on. And James Douglas tells this animal fable about a fisherman and a fox, and how the fox is trapped in the fisherman's hut. The fisherman is going to capture him and kill him. So the fox drags the fisherman's cloak onto the fire. It starts to burn. The fisherman rushes in to save his cloak, and the fox escapes. So that's how the Scots fight war. They don't fight when it's impossible odds, even if that's the honourable thing to do. They lure, they trick, they divert, they sneak around the side. And that's the way the Scots like to think of their leaders. They know that's the way it works. If you're fighting a much larger kingdom, you have to be cleverer than the opponents. And James Douglas, in a way, is seen as the embodiment of this crafty, clever leader. Yes, the Scots have learned the hard way that the way to survive, the way to beat a much larger opponent, is to use tricks, to use the knowledge of the landscape, for example. And Scotland is notoriously hilly and divided by large rivers. It's difficult to travel through. And there are areas where the larger, slower English armies with their heavy knights and their baggage trains and their siege weapons find it very difficult to move. So in those areas, people like James Douglas are able to muster their support, to hide out, and to launch attacks when the large English armies have moved on or have dispersed and gone home. So the Scots really learn to fight, for example, in the winter, when large English armies won't be campaigning in Scotland. They learn to, particularly under Robert Bruce, to invade northern England in those periods, to gather crops, to, if you like, blackmail local northern English communities who are paying them to go away. And it gets to the point where you just need to threaten to move into northern England, and those communities, the peasants and townspeople of the small shires of northern England, will offer you money not to come. And you can move through their lands and go further south and attack the next part of England. So the Scots are supporting their struggle under Robert Bruce by living off the land in England. That's how he rewards his followers. And James Douglas is extremely good at this kind of warfare. The Scots move very quickly. They cross the border with quite small forces, probably maybe 1,500 men. That might be an ordinary sort of size. All of them on horseback, just riding into England and moving too fast to be caught by the slower English forces, and living off the land, driving cattle back to Scotland, taking hostages that you can then release for ransom. So it's not a particularly honourable type of warfare, but it's them using the skills that they have. And Robert Bruce and James Douglas are masters at that kind of war. And it means you don't fight in the open field. It means you avoid a pitched battle, where the Scots have tried to fight the English in the open field. In the earlier parts of the war, they've had a disastrous outcome for them. So what we're told about the Scottish army by both Scottish writers and English writers is that they fight on foot. So they ride to battle but fight on foot. They don't have a big contingent of heavily armoured knights. The knights that they have, they will fight alongside the foot soldiers. Where they've tried to compete with the English by putting cavalry into the field, by having their horsemen, they're just outnumbered and less well equipped, and they get driven from the field, and the infantry are isolated. So I think Bruce in particular recognises that to encourage the foot soldiers, it's better to have the knights, the nobles fighting amongst them. And in the accounts that we have of his great victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, that's one of the things they say. They say the king and his nobles all fight alongside the foot to keep their spirits up. They fight with long spears, they fight with handheld axes and swords. One of the things the Scots have relatively little of is metal. They have to import their metal from the continent, and so axes and spears use less metal than full suits of armour or swords. So that tends to be the kind of considerations the Scots are thinking about when they're fighting. They fight in tightly packed bodies of spearmen with some archers but very few cavalry. I mean, the Battle of Bannockburn is the exception because it is where Bruce openly accepts battle against the English. It's the crowning moment of the war against the English, even though the war goes on for a long time afterwards. But it is the exception. And Bruce, I think, offers battle there because he's confident he will win. What we don't really know, or what there is a debate about, is the role that James Douglas plays in that battle. So in the poem written in the 1370s, the Bruce, James Douglas is one of the leading commanders. He commands one of the 4 divisions of the Scottish army. But actually all the contemporary accounts say there are only 3 divisions. And it's been suggested that the poet, John Barber, makes up the 4th division to give James Douglas a leading role. What's probably more likely is that Douglas is, after the battle, leading a force of cavalry that pursues the English king for 60 miles, harassing him as he retreats, trying to capture him, never quite managing to do that, but picking off and capturing individual English knights as they pursue. In the battle, he may have had a role with a small group of cavalry on the field too, at the edges of the conflict. But I think when you're talking about James Douglas later in the 14th century, you kind of want him to be at the centre of affairs, but I'm not sure he was at Bannockburn. I think the role of James Douglas in the bigger picture, in the struggle of Scotland for independence, is a crucial one. I think what we have to look at is the focal point of his life and his career, which is Robert Bruce. So King Robert is the key figure. And if you're thinking about what makes Robert such an effective king and such an effective war leader, it's his ability to choose excellent lieutenants. So people who can operate independently and follow his orders, but use their own initiative to bring out results when he's not there, who can also serve alongside him on campaign and he can rely on. So that Choice of James Douglas. I mean, James is a young man. He's not by any means the most important member of the group of nobles who support Robert, and yet Robert clearly identifies something about him which makes the king give him these leading roles. And certainly after Bannockburn, James Douglas very quickly is rising and becoming, in a sense, one of the two key lieutenants of the king. With Thomas Randolph, James Douglas is the other, if you like, part of this organisation. And he's entrusted with the defence of the Scottish border in 1317 when King Robert and Randolph have gone to Ireland as part of the campaign to try and take over Ireland from the English. So James Douglas, in a sense, is responsible for the defence of Scotland at that time. And I think if we're thinking about his significance for the survival of Scotland in this period, it's that ability to support Robert, that Robert as an individual cannot be everywhere. He needs people like Douglas to maintain his position, to hold the ground, but also to operate as leaders of invasions into England when Robert isn't there. And in the latter stages of Robert's reign, in the 1320s, Robert Bruce is a sick man, and he's really dependent on Douglas and Randolph to wage war on his behalf. He cannot take the field anymore. I think the difference between Thomas Randolph and James Douglas is that James is the war leader. Randolph leads in war too, but that is what James does. That is where his skills lie, and that's what Robert entrusts him with. Thomas Randolph is used in a range of other activities. So Robert sends him to the papal court to try and negotiate a better relationship with the Pope, who's been quite hostile to Robert. He sends him to the French court, where he successfully negotiates an alliance between the French king and Robert Bruce in 1326. He sends him to England to negotiate the peace treaty. So he uses him as a diplomat as well. I think what we know about James Douglas suggests he wouldn't be a very good diplomat. And I think in the same way, I would say that Robert probably sees Thomas as someone who, as the ruler or the regent, the guardian of Scotland, should Robert die, Thomas has the kind of skill set to be able to do that. James Douglas maybe doesn't. Though it should be remembered that in the arrangements that are made, Thomas Randolph is the first choice, but should he be dead, James Douglas would be the second. So I think that gives you an indication of the way Robert Bruce thinks about the two men. The hostility of the papacy towards Scotland is related to the question of the Crusades. So Pope John the 22nd, wants to organise the Christian kings into an expedition to try and recover the Holy Land, which has been lost 25 years before. And as part of that, he wants England and Scotland to end their war. So he wants a truce to be recognised, which will cease the fighting. At this point, the Scots are winning. They're in the ascendant, and they are at the point of taking the town of Berwick, which is the last town held by the English in Scotland. So Robert Bruce is reluctant, and in fact refuses to accept this. And the response of the Pope is to excommunicate him. And the idea is that that pressure will mean that Robert ultimately will accept the truce. But Robert refuses, and is quite insulting, and refuses to take the letters that the Pope sends. And therefore the Pope widens the sentence and includes the men who he sees as most responsible for the war, which are Thomas Randolph and James Douglas. And the pressure that the Pope is trying to put on Scotland is a problem for Robert. Ultimately, he places Scotland under an interdict which suspends all the functions of the church inside the kingdom. So James is caught up in this. From what we know, he's not necessarily that bothered at this stage in his life that he is under this sentence. So the excommunication is because England and Scotland are at war. Actually, a truce is agreed between them in 1323. So the issues underlying the excommunication go away to a certain extent. And then after a renewed period of war, a peace treaty is agreed between England and Scotland in 1328. So by that stage, the Pope is prepared to lift his sentence on Robert, on James, and on the Kingdom of Scotland as a whole. The choice of James Douglas as Robert Bruce's, if you like, champion, the person who's going to stand in for him on this holy venture. I mean, there are different accounts. The one that's most circulated in Scotland is that Robert chooses James. And certainly that's what James's descendants want to think. They want to think that James has been chosen because he is the best knight in the kingdom. And actually, given the relationship between the two men, I don't see anything implausible in that as being what happens. And the idea of James simply carrying the king's heart to Jerusalem makes a lot more sense, I think, as a principal plan. We know that other Scottish kings, for example, have that done for them later on. So if that's the plan, that would explain why it's being copied by later kings who want to emulate Robert Bruce, the kind of heroic king of late medieval Scotland. So I think probably the initial plan is for James to simply carry the heart to Jerusalem. Whether there's an additional element that he should go to Spain and to actually fight on behalf of Robert in the cause of Christendom against Islam, again, it's not implausible. It's not something that would be out of keeping with the ideas of the time, or with the idea that Robert, as someone who has spent his life fighting Christians, might be anxious about the state of his soul and wish for a kind of posthumous act which is going to release some of the sin from his soul, which is obviously central to the idea of medieval ideas of the afterlife, of purgatory. So that plan may very well be part of Robert's thinking too. I think it's hard to tell exactly the processes that happen. What we know from the account of John le Bel, a chronicler from the Low Countries, is that James takes ship from eastern Scotland. He stops in Flanders, where he's visited by knights from that area who have heard of his reputation. This is the kind of story that chroniclers like to tell about heroic knights meeting other figures from across Europe. It's not implausible that similar things are happening as James takes ship. And a sea route to the Mediterranean and to the Middle East is an entirely plausible route to take. In many ways, it's a safer route to travel by sea than overland across the European continent. So James may be intending to travel all the way by sea, and stopping off, perhaps in Galicia, he is encouraged to join an expedition at that point, or that may be part of the plan initially. I think either scenario could work. We certainly know a lot of Scottish pilgrims, as pilgrims all across Northern Europe, want to go to Santiago. They see it as one of the principal shrines of Christendom. For James to be travelling by ship along the north coast of Spain, to land and to go to visit Santiago, again, would be entirely in keeping with the kind of mission he's on. I mean, we know he stops at Bruges, or in Bruges port. It's possible that from there he may be going to the shrine of St. John the Baptist at Amiens, which is another very popular shrine with Scottish pilgrims. It's a major continental shrine quite close to, if you like, the coast of Flanders and northern France, which a lot of Scottish trade goes through. So it's possible that he is going to other shrines en route. There's clearly a company of men that go with James. We know that from the accounts that we get of his appearance in Spain, that a number of named figures, sort of half a dozen other knights are there. They would have their servants. So we might be talking about a company of a few dozen men, maybe 50 Scots going there. It's not an army, it's a small company rather than anything else. I don't think we can know what James's ultimate intentions are. Shall I say that again? I don't think we can know what James's ultimate intentions are. It's clearly something which, with hindsight, is very much the end of his life and the end of his career. But I don't think there's necessarily any reason to think that his job is to carry Robert as if on pilgrimage and then to return home to Scotland. He's, after all, quite a bit younger than Robert, and I think would probably still feel he had a duty to perform at home in defence of his own kingdom, despite the peace treaty. So the main account of James's death and his involvement in Spain is John Barbour's poem, The Bruce, from the 1370s. And it narrates it as the crowning moment, in some ways, of the narrative. So this is James as a Christian knight carrying the heart of his Lord in battle against the infidel. So it's a fulfillment of a crusading vow, in a way having narrated a whole story which is about military exploits, praiseworthy, honourable exploits against a Christian enemy. You're now ending with a story about how this greatest of knights is dying in defence of Christendom against Islam. So I think for Barber, it's a way of projecting this story onto a bigger stage, and something that clearly the Scots, I mean, this is written for a Scottish audience, an audience of Scottish noblemen. It's not in Latin, it's in vernacular Scots. So this audience wants to hear a story which praises James as a Christian knight. And the story gets retold in other Scottish poems and narratives that are produced in the 15th century as well, where James is shown as the champion of Scotland on a Christian stage, defending Christendom against the infidel. So that's the way the Scots want to see it. The death of James Douglas does seem to contradict a lot of the lessons that we're told about his life. He's a careful, crafty fighter who doesn't take unnecessary risks. He's someone that wins by outthinking the enemy, and yet when you get to this combat, he seems to charge into the midst of a larger force or be caught out by a larger force, and his own companions killed, and he killed in isolation in a way. It seems like a rather foolish way to die for a knight who's had such an effective career up to that point. And it does make you question something about the mentality of James at this point relative to his long career in Scotland. And perhaps it is an indication that this is something which he sees as a different kind of war and for a different kind of motivation. It is about his spiritual health. It is about his actions as a Christian rather than his need to defend his kingdom and to keep it safe by taking the best decisions. His responsibilities may seem less, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. It's impossible to get inside his head. You could argue simply it's very hot and Scots don't necessarily make the best decisions in hot weather. The reputation that James Douglas has as a fighter is someone who, whilst he is using intelligence and cunning, is also a risk taker. You know, he does climb up rope ladders in the depths of night to attack castle garrisons by surprise. That could easily lead to you to be killed at any point, quite easily. So I think we shouldn't see him as someone who's ultra cautious. He's clearly not that. But the kind of rash, direct attack that seems to happen at Tabor doesn't fit in with that sort of record or reputation that he has from Scotland. So I wonder if it is to do with a different kind of warfare that he feels that he's involved in. I mean, the story that James turns back to help his comrades is the one that's in John Barber's narrative. It presents James, again, up to his death as someone who is, as well as being a great knight, is a true friend. You know, the poem is a poem about a friendship between the king and James, but James is also seen as someone who takes care of his men, who are his relatives, who are his followers, who he has a responsibility for. So his death in that way, trying futilely to save the life of one of his comrades, in a way elevates his death as well. I think it's a good story. And for the Scots, the whole episode is one which is being told as a good story, as something which rounds out the narrative of Douglas, but also of Robert Bruce as well. It's his heart, and this is a kind of heroic end. And a lot of there is a kind of narrative that runs through the Scottish accounts, which is that the Scots aren't fighting an entirely fair kind of war. On a number of occasions in Scottish sources, English knights or even some Scottish knights are saying to Robert, you should fight in the open, you should fight in the most honourable way possible. And Robert is saying, well, you know, we'll fight in the best way that suits us. We'll fight in the way that helps us to win. He's being shown as pragmatic rather than perhaps a true chivalric hero. By presenting Douglas as dying in this way, you're giving a kind of response to that. You're saying, well, in the right cause and to the right end, a knight like James Douglas will give his life. There's a story, I think there's a story that relates to his journey. So that's the idea that when, this is from Lebel, that he's a writer from the Netherlands, and he's saying that when Douglas's ship puts in at Bruges, that lots of knights want to go and see him. And they're amazed that his face is unscarred because he's fought so many battles. So it's about his reputation again. And Lebel, who fights as a mercenary in the English armies in 1327, so he's faced Douglas across a battlefield, I mean, and never actually come to blows, clearly understands this reputation. And for example, in that campaign, James Douglas leads a night attack which breaks into the English camp, and all his men are shouting, "Douglas, Douglas," as they ride through, trying to get to the tent of the young English king. So I think Lebel has a very clear sense of this man as being a kind of, I don't know, almost a mythical figure in the war. So he wants to meet him. I mean, what would be more natural? Someone you've not met, but you've seen the effects of his leadership. You want to see what actually the man is like. And I think that may go for quite a wide circle of people on the continent. He has a reputation. I think what you do when somebody dies in a hot climate in the medieval or even in the early modern period is you boil down the body and you take away the bones, and then you inter the flesh where you are. You don't try and carry the whole thing back with you. So yes, it will be just the bones.
And the heart is like, I don't know if there are any evidences that you know about.
I don't know of any evidence that Douglas's heart is treated differently, but maybe you do.
Like there are some versions that they took it to the.
I mean, the heart is, because of course, the heart becomes the symbol of the family. It's placed on their coat of arms, and that's Bruce's heart. Bruce's heart is brought back for burial at Melrose. Melrose is an abbey in the Scottish borders, one of Bruce's favourite religious houses. He gives quite a lot of lands and revenues to the abbey while he's king. So it's a natural place for him to want his heart to repose. His body is buried at Dunfermline Abbey, which is the normal burial place for Scotland's kings. The fact that you have the Reformation in Scotland, which in Scotland is a revolutionary Calvinist uprising against the government in 1560. So it's very destructive. It's also very hostile to all forms of monastic life, means that Melrose Abbey, I think, is not functioning for centuries. It's also destroyed by an English invasion slightly before that. So the abbey is a ruin. And the heart is only rediscovered quite recently through excavation. So a lot of sites of great significance in the Middle Ages are consciously being destroyed by the reformers in the 16th century. I don't know about Douglas's heart. I mean, Douglas is buried in the family mausoleum in St Bride's Kirk in Douglas, and the tombs of his descendants are there as well. So that's the kind of family burial place. So Thomas dies as guardian and leaving the kingdom essentially leaderless. I think to have someone like James Douglas in that situation would have made a difference. The Scots in those years have to relearn some of the lessons of the previous period. So they risk pitched battles against their enemies and suffer two huge defeats. And thereafter they're fighting a kind of guerrilla war to hang on to the kingdom in the name of Robert Bruce's son and his dynasty. If James Douglas is around, I think they're probably much more effective, probably in avoiding those battles, but also in fighting that new phase of the war. So the absence of a leader with his experience, I think, is probably quite critical. He is, after all, the man that most of these people have followed under Robert Bruce. So he would have a natural authority in those circumstances. I think his survival would have made a huge difference. Yeah, so Scotland in the 1330s faces a renewed war against the English kings and against a rival claimant to the Scottish throne who's supported by the English king. So the wars recommence. And I think what James Douglas and Robert Bruce's contribution to that conflict is to show the Scots the way you survive and the way you win in that conflict. It takes another decade or two of hard fighting, and the Scots have never secured permanent recognition by the kings of England. So they are always facing the possibility of the English kings invading through the rest of the medieval period. So the war never ends on one level, but I think it becomes much less serious after the 1330s for the Scots. It gets caught up with the 100 Years' War between England and France, for example. So Scotland becomes a sort of secondary area of the conflict. As James Douglas's family and his descendants become key figures in the defence of Scotland in those wars. That's where the Douglas family gets its reputation, carrying the heart of Robert Bruce as one of their heraldic symbols on their arms and claiming the legacy of both James Douglas and Robert Bruce. So the Douglas family do continue as major nobles and as major war leaders of Scotland. Most of the lands that the family have lie in the border region with England. So they're the areas that are most heavily fought over, that are most at risk from the English. And the Douglases, starting from James and using James, if you like, as their sort of iconic ancestor, create this image of the family as the defenders of Scotland, as the war wall, as the kind of outer curtain wall of the Scottish kingdom, keeping the English at bay. So they have a reputation as military leaders, as commanders, as people who keep the peace in the borders as well. And that continues for, well, over a century after James Douglas dies. And the Douglas family in various branches continues for much longer than that. But James's direct descendants last in that role until the 1450s, where they come into conflict with the Scottish kings and he has them stripped of their lands and executed. So James Douglas's probably illegitimate son is a man called Archibald, known as Archibald the Grim, or Black Archibald, or Archibald the Terrible, all of which are giving you an image of the kind of man he was. He was said to carry a sword of enormous length and weight and to wield it with great effect. And he was very much his father's son. He's a very young man, I think, when James Douglas dies. He may even be an infant. He dies in 1400. So he has a long life and a long career, much of it as a soldier. As probably an illegitimate son, he doesn't inherit any lands, so he has to kind of make his own career. He serves in France for the French king against the English. He serves the Scottish kings, and then quite late on in his life he becomes Lord of Galloway, the great province of southwestern Scotland. And then probably when he's in his 60s, he becomes Earl of Douglas and inherits the whole of the Douglas lands. And his line, the Black Douglases, are the line that descends from James. And in some ways, he's a figure very much like his father in terms of reputation and character, I think. As you might expect from the descendants of James Douglas, the Douglases are not far removed from violence at any stage. So there are different branches of the family and they come into conflict. They're also an extremely powerful family within the Scottish nobility. And at periods when the Scottish king is a child, which happens quite frequently in the 15th century, the Douglases are very often in a leading position in the kingdom. So just after the accession of King James II in 1437, as a 7-year-old boy, the young Earl of Douglas and his brother are invited to a meal at Edinburgh Castle, and, well, a slightly later legend says they're served with a black bull's head, or possibly a black boar's head, which signifies treason. And as soon as that's placed on the table, they're arrested, taken outside and beheaded. And it's essentially to remove them from the field. It may be instigated by the people who are around the young king, but also possibly by their own great uncle, a man called James the Gross, James the Fat, who is the person who inherits the earldom. So it may be a bit of internal family bloodletting that these two teenage boys are being eliminated quite brutally in this manner. So the Black Douglases are the most powerful branch. The Red Douglases in many ways are the junior branch in the early 15th century. But the conflict between the Black Douglases and the kings of Scotland, King James II in particular, leads to their forfeiture, so their lands are taken from them. One earl is murdered by the king, stabbed to death by the king during a banquet, and his younger brothers are driven into exile. So the Black Douglases are driven out of Scotland essentially in the middle of the 15th century. The Red Douglases are the branch that survived. They're the Earls of Angus, but they're also great figures in the borders as well. And they're the family that survives subsequently and continues the line. But in the 16th century, they're not so very different from their cousins earlier on. They seize the young King James V and try and run Scotland in his name too. And they are driven out of Scotland briefly before recovering. So the Douglases remain this kind of unruly, powerful, what we might call overmighty subjects, a powerful noble family who are always capable of challenging the king to press their own interests. That's an interesting question. The reputation of James Douglas and Robert Bruce is not necessarily, I think all Scots will have heard of them. So you will have heard of Robert Bruce, and Bruce is, his sidekick, his lieutenant, his partner is James Douglas. So a lot of Scots will have come across these people. They'll see them when they go to historic sites, for example, but they'll also see them they may have studied them at school, or they may see them in things like print books or popular histories and things like that. So they have a presence. Scottish history is built around iconic figures in many ways. It's hard to quite get past people like William Wallace, Robert Bruce, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Mary Queen of Scots. And James Douglas is in that mix. He's a heroic figure who has a story to tell. And Scottish history has always been about telling those stories. So I think people will know who he is. I'm a Scottish historian. I think these figures should be known better. They should be understood better. They should be moved from being perhaps sometimes quite one-dimensional figures to try and understand them as more rounded people, as people reacting to circumstances and changing in response to them. And I think understanding James Douglas, looking at his life, illuminates a whole range of different aspects that you could talk about medieval society in Scotland. I think it's absolutely wonderful that James Douglas is recognised at the place where he died, at Tiber, and that he has become the focus of such fun, I think, and also commemoration, and that his name and his achievements are being recognised somewhere well beyond Scotland. And the story is presumably being retold to visitors to the festival, and therefore is spreading to other parts of the world. It's being taken to new audiences all the time. I think it's fantastic. That's what people like James Douglas wanted. That's why John Barber, when he's writing his poem, is so keen to tell all these stories, because it's about reputation. It's about fame. It's about trying to keep the memory of these people and their achievements alive. Barber says specifically, he talks with audience, says, this is what these people did to save Scotland. What will you do if the same problem arises? He's talking to people in the audience. And so in a sense, people still remembering James Douglas in the 21st century is doing the same kind of thing. It's creating this image and this memory of a figure from, 700 years ago. I think to think about James Douglas as a person, it's probably to acknowledge that a lot of the characteristics that were valued in the 14th century were ones that we might very well find quite appalling today. He is violent. He is cruel to his enemies. But as you might also say, he is extremely loyal. He keeps his word. He makes his agreements and sticks by them through his whole life up to his death. And I think those characteristics are one which speak to the audience. But I think we want to think about people from the medieval past as reflecting values from that time too. Understanding the past is about understanding how the mental world of people from those times aren't like us. They are different. They aren't simply responding in the same way that we would. And James Douglas clearly is not that kind of person. But he is a large figure. He is a figure that embodies all kinds of characteristics, which makes us think. I would love to come to Tiber. It looks fantastic. And I don't know. I really don't know what I would find there. But it looked like everybody was having from the film that I saw, it looked like everybody was having a great time, and also that people were engaging with the reality of what had gone on. They were thinking about the history. They were recounting the history, and that's important. I think that people trying to understand, but also simply commemorating and remembering past events so that they're not forgotten. And so placing that back in the centre of the town's life, I think, is a magnificent achievement.